further in the program, it's an honor for me today on behalf of EMF to welcome Sharon Heal, the director of the UK Museum Association. We have returned time and again over these last couple of days to the difficult and diverse times we live in. As the managers of a long-lived award scheme, we are also made acutely aware of how difficult life can be out there for the most outspoken museums, and not least for the most outspoken museum directors. These news travel back to us, and we are very happy when we hear that having received an award from us, for instance, the Council of Europe award, has been a part of the defense structure of a museum. The other day I quoted how some of this year's candidates warned us that freedom and democracy are vulnerable, and as institutions we have to be careful with what we tend to remember and what we try to forget. One museum states that its main goal is to make people aware that totalitarian regimes can easily occur again, and we need to find our own moral compass to minimize the risk. And they say it's not a time to turn a blind eye to crimes and international solidarity or the difficult areas of a country's history. And I think at this time, as museum professionals and as museum activists, it's important for us to recall the very rich traditions of museum activism and advocacy from the previous century, not just in small alternative institutions, but in big national museums, famously, for instance, the Smithsonian's engagement with the civil rights movement. Museums are inevitably part of the societal issues of one's area and of one's era. There is no way to place one's institution outside these issues. There is no neutral space. One is, willingly or not, part of the conflicts of one's period. I think we should be careful not to underestimate the deep affiliation, the deep ties between museums and the status quo or the powers that be. And I am these days more and more interested in how saying nothing, how not actively protesting or actively resisting proved to be an active defense of the status quo and of the most conservative forces in society. A museum is, as they would say in the previous century, part of the solution or part of the problem. Sharon?
Thank you, Jette, and thank you to the EMYA Organising Committee for asking me to speak today. I've written and spoken about museum activism and campaigning over the course of the last 4 or 5 years in the UK and internationally, and most recently at the Museums Association conference in Belfast, where the theme was dissent in the museum sector. So what's the problem? One of the things we've tried to do in the UK is reflect critically on the challenges that we face in the sector, but also the challenges that our communities face. To do that, we have to think about the context. For us in the UK, there is some good news. Our government has announced that austerity is over. Unfortunately, the real picture regarding poverty in the UK doesn't come from the government. It comes from organisations such as Human Rights Watch, which reported last week that the UK government was breaching its human rights international duty to keep people from hunger by pursuing cruel and harmful policies with no regard to the impact of children living in poverty. That fact, and the fact that 30% of all children in the UK grow up in poverty, according to the Child Poverty Action Group, is part of the context that our communities live in. In the parliamentary constituency that I live in East London, 54% of all children grow up in poverty. In London, in one of the richest cities in the world. This image is of a food bank, and over 4 million people are affected by food poverty in the UK. And I think we should stop talking about food poverty, because it is just poverty after all. Homelessness is on the increase in the UK. It's a visible reminder in the streets of every town and city that cuts in benefits and the welfare system and social services and social housing mean that people are slipping through the holes in a non-existent safety net. And as been mentioned at this conference, we live in a time of climate crisis, not climate change, climate crisis. Every minute, 1 truck worth of rubbish is dumped into the ocean, and most of it is plastic. The stats are endless and the stats are disastrous. And there's a spectre haunting Europe of populism, of the rise of the far right, of intolerance and division in all of our communities, nowhere more so than in the UK, and the current EU elections have exposed those raw divisions that are renting our communities asunder. So it's easy to point out what's wrong, what's the solution, and what, if anything, can museums do about it? I think we can't rely on the generosity of the rich to fix things. The new breed of philanthro-capitalists are not going to bail us out. This is Jeff Bezos, the chief exec of Amazon. He pledged last year $2 billion to charities that deal with education and homelessness. But he gets to dictate how that money is spent, and more importantly, who is worthy. According to a report by the Swiss bank UBS, last year billionaires made more money than at any other point in human history. And what's striking is that the rich are spending less on charity and the poor are giving a higher percentage of their income to good causes. But we don't have to take it lying down, although sometimes it helps. This is the campaign group Sisters Uncut at the British Film and Television Awards, protesting on the red carpet about Time's Up and Me Too, and the campaign against discrimination against women, but also the campaign against the cuts to services that help women who are victims of domestic violence. Those protests took place 100 years after some women got the vote in the UK, and we are still waiting for equality. Their red carpet protest was a response to a more genteel protest of the actors on the red carpet who were wearing black and standing with campaigners. It's possible to take a stand, and that stand can take many forms. I was struck by the example of the endurance swimmer Lewis Pugh, who swam not the width of the channel, but the length of the channel to highlight the impact of pollution and the climate crisis on our oceans. I was struck by the example, as I'm sure many of you were, of the American footballer Colin Kaepernick, who is the face of the advertising campaign for Nike. It's 4 years since he knelt during the national anthem to highlight social and racial injustice in the United States. That movement spread around the country, causing Trump to say that any player who knelt during the anthem was a son of a bitch and should be fired. And he has never played Major League Football since. Sometimes activism can pop up where you least expect it. These posters appeared on bus shelters in Brixton in South London, so designers can be activists too. They were created to highlight the lack of opportunities for black actors and the lack of role models by the advertising organisations and designers Legally Black UK and Special Patrol Group. I was walking through central London last year and I stumbled across the Trump blimp, which was flying in Parliament Square. It was created as a protest against his visit to the UK. There was also a blimp created of the London Mayor Sadiq Khan. Activism can be complex. There can be protest and there can be counter-protest. The reason that the mayor is in a yellow bikini is because he banned adverts promoting negative body images on the London Tube network. Khan said, as the father of 2 teenage girls, I'm concerned about this kind of advertising which can demean people, particularly women, and make them ashamed of their bodies. It's high time it came to an end. Several London museums said they wanted to collect those blimps. And I think we often default to collecting and collections when we think about contemporary society and campaigning. And yes, those blimps should be in a museum collection. If they are collected, though, we should be using them to unlock conversations about power and trust and gender and discrimination. One of the most recent manifestations of activism is the Extinction Rebellion protests. I was in central London at the time of the protests, came out of the tube station at Oxford Circus, and there was the pink boat and the protesters, hundreds if not thousands of young people dancing and protesting about the destruction of the planet. And I was on my way to the BBC to talk on a panel discussion about sponsorship, philanthropy and museums. And one of the points I made was that while we wring our hands thinking about some of the complex issues that affect our institutions, young people who are the missing generation that we talked about yesterday, the 15 to 25-year-olds that don't come to our museums, are on the streets and activated on these issues. How do we draw them in on the issues that they are passionate about? The blimps remind us that protest can be creative and it can be amusing. It's not straight-laced and humorless. Many museums collected the placards such as these from the anti-Trump demonstrations. But we need to do more than collect the ephemera. Protest is not always about the big actions. Small actions are powerful too. I went to a Celtic football match last year and was struck in the programme when it mentioned a campaign started by 2 women fans, an online petition to highlight period poverty and to increase the visibility of women's issues in football. It led to Celtic becoming the first football club in the UK to provide free sanitary products at its grounds. The inspiration for activism can come from cultural sources. No doubt some of you saw the Coen brothers film 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri. It reminded me that making the campaign visible is especially powerful to those of us that have no voice or feel we are not being listened to. And interestingly, that film inspired campaigning in the UK too. These lorries were driven around central London when the inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire opened. They read 71 dead and still no arrests. How come? Cultural objects and images have power and resonance and can support our activism. And we should remember that campaigning can be effective and bring about change. Otherwise, why would any of us do it? In Ireland, we saw the results of the abortion referendum last year, which tell us that change is possible. So all of this is change and context, and it impacts us. We cannot and do not exist in a bubble. The question is, I think, how do we reconcile what happens outside the institution with what we do inside? Can we provide the emotional and intellectual space in the cultural sector to have challenging conversations and to try to make change? As Dayan said, referred to, activism can come to the institution. Activism can take many forms, and whether we like it or not, it is coming to a cultural institution near us. The campaign by artists against the weapons manufacturer BAE and its sponsorship of the Great Exhibition of the North nearly led to that exhibition being called off. The Natural History Museum in the UK is touring Dippy the dinosaur to museums across the UK, and several have been sites of protest with Extinction Rebellion supporters holding die-ins here in Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow. I think it poses a very sharp ethical question for those of us that work in the museum sector, can we continue to accept fossil fuel sponsorship when we know the uncontested damage it does to the planet? We've also observed that artists have the power and the agency to be activists, and they are prepared to use it. Nan Golding, the artist, has used her platform to protest Sackler sponsorship of cultural institutions. This is at the Met in New York, and that has been successful. To me, it begs the question, how do museums campaign? How do we manifest our activism? And of course, when we ask that question, immediately we get stuck on a definition. What does it mean? To me, museum activism is simply using our collections and our space to effect positive change in the world, to make a difference, to actively stand for equality and for social justice. It's a spectrum of activity. It could be the Museum of Homelessness here at the Tate, campaigning with its community to highlight issues, to change perceptions, and to bring about change. It could be the power of networks. I've observed there's been a flourishing and burgeoning of networks in the museum sector in the UK. Networks for LGBTQ staff, networks around disability, such as the Disability Cooperative Network, networks around gender, such as Space Invaders and the Network for Change, networks for front of house staff, and networks for staff from working class backgrounds, such as Museum as Muck, and also networks for BME staff, and this is Museum Detox at the Museum of London. And what's been interesting to observe, I think it's a sign of a healthy sector that we have so many networks, is that those networks have very quickly evolved from peer and professional development networks to networks that are activists in the sector, thinking about not just how we support and develop ourselves, but how we change representation in our collections, how we change our workforce, and how we change communities. As a Museums Association, we are a network, and we have recently changed our mission, vision, and values. Our mission is inspiring museums to change lives. Our vision is for inclusive museums at the heart of their communities. And our values include inclusivity, diversity, and equality. And we are a campaigning organisation. It's not been a smooth or even journey to become a campaigning organisation over the last 5 years, but we've had some amazing achievements on the way. The growth in our members has been, I think, an affirmation of the stand that we've taken. We're 130 years old as an association, and for the first time ever, we have more than 10,000 individual members. Our flagship campaign, Museums Change Lives, was launched 7 years ago. It's quite radical, but it's based on a simple idea that museums can make a positive difference working in society with their communities. But we had to campaign long and hard to get understanding, acceptance, and traction on these issues. Its themes are simply that museums can enhance health and well-being, can create better places for us to live and work, and can inspire debate and reflection. It feeds into our code of ethics. Yes, we do casework. Yes, we run an ethics committee, and that is important. But first and foremost, this is a campaigning document. Its first principle is that our ethical commitment is to public benefit and to working with our communities. It deals with issues such as repatriation and restitution and sponsorship and those thorny issues that we have to grapple with. And I think it's quite simple in terms of sponsorship. All the Code of Ethics says is think about the values of your institution and your museum, and think about the values of those that you choose to work with and that want to fund you and that you want to accept money from. Is there alignment? If there is, then you can go ahead and have that relationship. Do they have and work to the same values that you believe in? I see our Code of Ethics as a campaign to get museums and the people who work in them to think actively and reflectively about ethics, and our activism should be shaped by our ethics. We know that museums have been around for 200 years. They're not going to change overnight. So we provide resources to support socially engaged practice. This is not just a way of working for us, it is the work. Last year, we produced Power to the People, a framework for participatory practice to just support people on that journey to working well with their communities, to provide a common language for museums, funders, stakeholders, and communities. We know there's a growing body of participatory work in museums, and there's evidence that many more want to improve their relationship and collaboration with their communities. We've just finished a pilot project called Partnerships with Purpose, and that has worked to put community organisations, third sector organisations and charities and museums in a room together to see if the sparks fly and to see if partnerships can flourish. It's been really interesting to observe what's happened in those meetings and at those events. The community organisations come and they haven't worked with museums before and they're curious about what that relationship can provide. And the museums come that haven't worked with those particular community organisations and they're curious and they want to see what can flourish out of those partnerships. And already those partnerships are growing. Our most recent publication is Empowering Collections, and you might question, after I've talked so much about community and about the public and public benefit, why we would publish on collections. Well, we know that collections are the USP of our institutions. They're the things that make us different, and they're the things that make us special. As the Museums Association, we have a track record of funding into collections and supporting this work. But also, we know that collections is where the power lies in the institution. The collections themselves are powerful, but often those who work closely with the collections have the power. So this research is based on speaking to over 1,000 people in the sector. And the themes that emerged from it were that we want collections to be relevant, we want collections to be dynamic, and we want collections to be empowering. We think we need to bring about a culture change in our organisations in terms of how we use our collections and connect with communities. But having said all of this, we have to recognise that as the Museums Association, we are part of the museum establishment. As I mentioned, we're one of the oldest associations in the world. Part of our journey of change has been thinking about what can we do and what change and difference can we make. We know that there's a problem with the UK cultural sector. Our workforce and our audiences do not represent the diversity of our communities. Each year we survey our members, and that's a snapshot of the larger workforce, and the reality will come as no surprise to people in this room. People who work in museums are more white than the general population, they're less likely to be disabled, women vastly outnumber men apart from in positions of leadership, and we are much more likely to have been privately educated than the rest of the population. We also have more qualifications than the average working population. We remain a monocultural workforce with very little in the way of diversity. We do not represent our communities, and that is problematic. So what is to be done? For us, it's about living the change that we want to see. Our response has been to embed our values in everything we do. Our values run through our programming, our funding, our collections work, our professional development, and our conference. We know we have a powerful platform and we use it to showcase change and activism to the sector. For the last 3 years, we've had a festival of change at our annual conference that has been created and co-produced with the sector and people outside the sector. This is the trans activist Charlie Craggs, who ran a nail bar, a transphobia nail bar at our conference in Manchester. We worked with Museum Detox to run a white privilege clinic at our conference, which was challenging for us and challenging for our delegates. We don't just give this work a platform, but we also fund it. Through the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund, we fund £1 million worth of collections activity a year. And part of the criteria for that fund is to get museums to think about the difference that they're trying to make working with their collections. So this exhibition was in Sheffield, and it was about 200 years of that city as a city of protest. I was really struck when I visited the exhibition about how they'd reflected on the history of the city through the collections and brought it bang up to date with the issues that their communities are concerned about now. But I was in particular struck by these two cabinets. On the left hand is a cabinet about the miners' strike, and at the back of that cabinet, just barely visible, is a roll of toilet paper with the head of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK in the 1980s on it. And I had a roll of that toilet paper growing up in Yorkshire in the 1980s. And I was struck that next to that cabinet was another one about the Trump protests across the UK and in Sheffield. And there was some Trump toilet paper that was used on those demonstrations and protests. And I thought, only in a museum could you have that lens of history. Only in a museum could collections be used to show how protest has evolved and how activism is manifesting itself. We absolutely must take people with us. But that doesn't just mean outreach. It means inreach, bringing people into the institution and not just the usual suspects. We shouldn't ever describe communities as hard to reach, because the reality is they are just easy to ignore. I admire the work of Swansea National Waterfront Museum and the Cardiff story that they've done with their refugee communities, not just bringing them into the institution, but changing perceptions and combating racism. I admire the work that's been co-curated in collaboration with parents of children with special educational needs and disability across museums in the southeast of England. You could argue that's what museums should be doing anyway, but are we all doing it? And are we working with those communities to create those programs? The organizer, Sam Bowen, said she is actively campaigning to get museums to live up to their social responsibility to include these families and children. I admire the work that Glasgow Women's Library has done, taking over spaces to make the point about the lack of representation of women from different backgrounds in positions of power. There's lots of ways of campaigning and making change. Some of it is quiet and stealthy. Some of it challenges us beyond our comfort zones. This type of stuff is not easy, and it's not without challenge. It can come at a cost. Laura Rajkovic, the former director of the Queen's Museum in New York, spoke at our conference in Belfast last year. And she told the story of how, in effect, she was pushed aside and had to stand down as the director of that institution because her board felt she had crossed a line with her decision to close the museum during Donald Trump's inauguration, to participate in a protest against plans to cut museum and arts funding and the impact of his election on communities. So they closed the museum for regular programs and held an event where the public could come along and discuss the impact of the inauguration. When museums take a stand or do something different or try to tackle difficult issues, it can come at a cost. The British Council last year distanced itself from an exhibition about slavery at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas because it was too political. How many times are we told that we are being too political? Ironically, the project was part of a series called Difficult Conversations, reflecting on the UK's involvement in the slave trade in the Caribbean. The British Council was accused of censorship, and the gallery's director, Amanda Coulson, said people there had been left with a general feeling of being silenced and exploited. As we've heard many times at this conference, museums are not neutral, and we should all be activists behind that slogan. So what's new, what's happening now, and what's next? Activism is not just challenging, it can be hugely rewarding. The work that Birmingham museums are doing to open up to local communities and to decolonise their collections is brave and powerful, and it has started a trend and a conversation in the sector in the UK. The National Trust has just announced a programme to democratise and decolonise its properties, giving agency to others to have that conversation, and in particular young people. It looks like it's going to be a powerful programme. 1 in 6 of their properties have links to slavery and empire. And of course, it's been immediately vilified in the right-wing press. Some of our activism is on the streets. For many years now, museum workers have joined together to go on pride demonstrations in London, in Cardiff, in these images, but across the UK. And that's a powerful way of saying our museums can tell diverse, rich, and powerful stories. Some of it is about new museums. Some of it is about taking on topics that others might shy away from, such as the Vagina Museum or the Museum of Homelessness or the Queerseum. But it's not just the start-ups, and it's not just the small museums, and it's not just the single issues. As Jette said, national institutions, despite the hierarchies, despite the silos, despite the weight of hundreds of years of history, can decide to work in different ways if they choose. I like the example of National Museum Wales. Their participation and co-production is second to none, and who decides their work with Woolwich, the homelessness charity, is changing, I think, the way that organisation works and thinks and behaves. This, to me, is museum activism. In communities that are split by Brexit and risk further divisions, museums can be a space for inclusion and tolerance, as is Bolton Museum, that created this space in a town that is a stomping ground for the far right. This, to me, is museum activism. To bring people with lived experience of homelessness, not just to the event, but onto the board and into the heart of the institution in the way that the Museum of Homelessness does. This, to me, is museum activism. To break out of the subject specialist straitjackets, to say that we'll explore archaeology and anthropology and ethnography of the jungle in Calais, and we'll co-curate an exhibition with former inhabitants, as they have done at the Pitt Rivers Museum, where everything on display is a temporary loan from displaced people, activists, and volunteers. This, to me, is museum activism. When we first discussed Museums Change Lives with our board of trustees, we said in order to deliver it, we need radical workers. But the board was not ready for that. So 8 years ago, they said, we're wary of using the word radical. In fact, they took a vote and decided not to. But that was 8 years ago, and this is now. Richard Sandel and Robert Janes put a call out for proposals for a chapter for a book on museum activism a couple of years ago. And I put in a proposal based on interviewing 15 people who work in the sector. That proposal was accepted, and I interviewed the people who I thought were activists in the UK. Their work is fascinating, but what was interesting was that a fair number of them didn't want to be labelled as activists. They said, no, that's not the label or the term that we want used about ourselves or our work. Because academic publishing takes so long, 2 years later, the book is published. And I went back to the people that I'd interviewed, and every single one of them is now happy to claim that label of activism. As Richard Sandel and Robert Janes say in the preface, museum activism involves work that is undeniably challenging and risky. But there is a growing and irresistible imperative to redefine the contemporary museum as an active agent in shaping the world around us and making it a better place for all. This work is not a phase or a fad. We won't grow out of it. We won't get over it. It's an idea whose time has come. Thank you.